Welcome to 3 Count Commentaries. It is time for me to talk about one of my favorite characters, one of my favorite wrestlers, Ted DiBiase, the Million Dollar Man. What a tremendous biography on this guy. There was so much that he did in his life and career. Clearly, you weren't going to be able to get it all in there. But I think they did a really good job of getting the important bits, I believe. So I have to come in and add a little color for the people who are only know Ted DiBiase from being the Million Dollar Man. I'm going to talk a little bit about his time in Mid South. We're also going to talk about the lawsuit that he was involved with that they went nowhere near in this, and I wouldn't expect that they would. But let's get into it. They talked about his family life, which I thought was very good. About his stepfather who died in the ring when Ted was 15, died of a heart attack. But he really wanted to be like his dad, which was great. He got into wrestling in about 1974 in Lubbock, Texas. He started working in Mid South maybe the next year. So over the course of the next 10 years, Ted DiBiase bounced around between primarily 3 or 4 territories. He was in Mid South a lot. He was in Georgia a lot, and he went up to the WWF. His primary base was in Mid South, but he lived in, I believe, either Mississippi or Georgia at the time. Mid South was a notoriously grueling schedule. For those of you who have never seen like a map of Bill Watts Mid South wrestling, it is New Orleans, Louisiana, Oklahoma, I think parts of Alabama. I was right. It was Mississippi, Alabama, Oklahoma, and Louisiana. So it was technically called Tri-State when it was initially formed by Leroy McGurk. But when Watts took over, which was much later, it's a long story, it was pretty much those same 4 states. And it was pretty much a grueling schedule, a lot of driving. And Ted was away from his family a lot at this time. So in the 1980s, he was mostly known as a babyface. He's a pretty good babyface too. He had worked with Hulk Hogan in Madison Square Garden and was the first WWF North American champion. That title does not exist anymore. It is defunct. It was replaced by the Intercontinental title some years later. That title was formed in like 1979. So by 1980, I think 1981, that belt was gone. So he wrestled Hulk Hogan in Madison Square Garden. They actually showed footage of that, which was pretty cool. But he spent the bulk of his time in Mid-South Wrestling, where he was just a plain old everyday babyface. It was pretty good. But he was mostly the sidekick to Junkyard Dog. And Bill Watts had a really good idea because he felt like Junkyard Dog had already had the run with the Freebirds and he wanted to do something else. He needed another big star for Junkyard Dog to work with. And Ted DiBiase, it was in the book King of New Orleans, that Ted DiBiase actually volunteered to turn heel and attack Junkyard Dog in order to become the next top heel in the territory. So the way it was set up was he would challenge Junkyard Dog for the title in a straight up friendly match, and then he would turn heel in the match. And then from there, he would go on to be a bad guy. And Ted DiBiase and Junkyard Dog, 2 weeks after the heel turn, drew 22,800 people in the Superdome of New Orleans. The match ended in a disqualification because, it was only 2 weeks after the heel turn was televised. But a tremendous amount of interest in this feud. And Ted DiBiase ended up really being the top heel pretty much from that day forward until he ended up turning babyface again in 1986. He formed the Rat Pack, which is actually predates the Four Horsemen. The Rat Pack was Ted DiBiase, who was known as the Big Cheese, Maniac Mac Bourne, who everybody knows as the original Doink the Clown, and everybody's favorite wrestler, Hacksaw Jim Duggan. So this was back when they used to call him Jim Dugan. That was just a Watts affectation, calling him Dugan. And anyway, they were the top heels in the territory, often feuding with Junkyard Dog and Mr. Wrestling 2 and Mr. Olympia and all these people. It was a tremendous time. It was around this time that Ted DiBiase started wearing a black glove, one single black glove, and ended up getting a tremendous amount of heat with his ability to cheat and with his technical skill and his prowess. And by this time, he had been there for a long time. So the people felt like they knew him and started seeing him, become much, much worse as time went on. In 1986, DiBiase turns babyface. They do an angle where, and they discussed this in the documentary, he was on the short list to be the NWA world champion with how good he was doing in Mid-South and how good he was doing in Georgia. It ended up not happening, but he was on the short list. But he ended up leaving the territory. Bill Watts ended up selling what would later be known as UWF to Jim Crockett. And when he sold to Jim Crockett, Ted DiBiase went to the WWF. There was just a very short story of the bitter Ole Anderson, who was the booker and part owner of the Georgia territory. He claimed that Ted DiBiase had told him that he was never going to go to the WWF and that he was going to be there with him because he wanted to be near his family and all that stuff. And then Ted DiBiase popped up on WWF TV. And this is, of course, where we get the $1 Million Man, Ted DiBiase. An absolutely epic character. A character that was so great, even the Wrestling Observer newsletter, even those cranks really loved it and put it over. And it's hard to say how amazing this gimmick was. You have to experience it for yourself. And I'm pretty sure everybody listening to the sound of my voice have seen the $1 Million Man, Ted DiBiase, before. But seeing it in action was something that was tremendous. I want to read you the write-up from Dave Meltzer on the $1 Million Man, Ted DiBiase. He says, quote, "If there was ever a Rodney Dangerfield of professional wrestling, Ted DiBiase would be it. DiBiase's ring character of the $1 Million Man obviates, I don't know about that, what is beneath the exterior. Probably the best worker Titan Sports has had in the new era. But even though Ted DiBiase is well publicized, his gimmick and name are over to the general fan. His co-workers respect him as being the top performer on the circuit, but most fans don't see past the exterior. On the exterior is the physique. DiBiase doesn't have the worst physique in wrestling. He hardly looks like Dusty Rhodes, but he's no bodybuilder either. And in the circuit, where fans judge wrestlers by the size of their biceps, DiBiase comes up short in so-called ability in many people's eyes. DiBiase is someone who was practically born into the wrestling business. And they go through his backstory. We can skip all of that. So Meltzer explains that when DiBiase left, he ended up getting the WWF, the $1 Million Man role, which Meltzer calls the wrestling version of Vince McMahon. He says, while the role didn't take off immediately, it was McMahon's personal idea, so it was pushed until it was over. And DiBiase played the arrogant role tremendously, to the point where it overshadowed his wrestling ability. While DiBiase was Titan's premier worker, he was also in a place where work rate mattered none. But as a heel role, the $1 Million Man was a hit, and 2 consecutive Heel of the Year awards is proof of that. So even the cranks over at the Wrestling Observer newsletter were amazed at how well this thing worked. It was a tremendous gimmick, and it fit the culture at the time. And they talked about this in the documentary, where movies like Wall Street was out, and everything was about excess, big money, big cars. And the $1 Million Man fit the zeitgeist of that character. Even though, kind of Ric Flair had been doing it up to that point, this was cartoon land. He was cartoonishly rich. Like, they called him the $1 Million Man, but he seemed to have endless money. So it wasn't like he was limited to having $1 million. He had however much money he needed to have to do whatever he needed to do. In the documentary, it was stated that Ted DiBiase left for the WWF because he saw WrestleMania 3. and he saw the 93,000 people in the Silver Dome or whatever, and he wanted to match and or exceed that. And of course, it didn't happen because no event has matched WrestleMania 3. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. But Ted DiBiase liked the gimmick when it was pitched to him, and it was all about getting this thing working and the cultural relevance of it. Was a very timely gimmick and how it was Vince McMahon in wrestling form. And so Vince really wanted it to work. One of my favorite parts of the documentary is when Ted said that he had a 20-year career up to this point, even though I don't think it was 20 years, it was probably like 14. And he says that what he became most known for was his laugh. And Vince overheard him laughing and then told him that that's what the character has to do. And then, of course, he got the opportunity to live the gimmick, which got him some heat, but he had so much respect in the locker room that he kind of people got over it. And then they went over the story of him trying to buy the WWF title from Andre the Giant, which I didn't see anything in any rule books that you can't buy the title. Ted DiBiase should be the champion. And then, of course, it gets to main event WrestleMania 4. So that was great. He got the $1 million championship. He ended up making more money with that than he ever did with the WWF title. And they skipped from him buying the belt to his family struggles and his infidelity with his wife, which is covered tremendously in this documentary called The Price of Fame, which is I think a Ted DiBiase produced documentary, which goes into what he's doing nowadays, basically being an evangelist and everything. And it's on Tubi, if I remember correctly. So you can watch it on Tubi if you just need more Ted DiBiase. I also did a review of it, if I remember, for the channel. And basically, after his wrestling career, he settled down, became a pastor at a church, and lived life happily ever after. He was brought into the Hall of Fame in, I think, 2010 or 2011. And the documentary stops right there. There was no talk about his managing career or him winning a tag team championship with IRS. Those little nuggets and details that people like me care about, but the general audience wouldn't give a damn about Ted DiBiase, being embroiled in several feuds for the next, for the entirety of the New Generation era, him paying guys to turn on other guys. I mean, just the wackiness of the Lex Luger Tatanka story, which is tremendous. That everybody thinks Lex Luger is the guy who sold out, and it turns out it was Tatanka the whole time. The $1 Million Man and his temptations turning the 1, 2, 3 Kid villainous against Razor Ramon. $1 Million Man trying to pay dudes to get championships for him, like Sid to get the Intercontinental title, or how he had gambled away his big money on Bam Bam Bigelow to defeat Lawrence Taylor in the main event of WrestleMania. Like, this was fun stuff that he was doing, and it was interesting stuff, but it just wasn't important to the general audience. And it's not anything that he can go into too much detail about, but Ted DiBiase, brought us The Undertaker. He brought us, Stone Cold Steve Austin. He was, involved with those angles and involved with those guys. And he had a really fun feud with Dusty Rhodes in the early 90s. I mean, it was cartoon version of Flair and Dusty, because this is where you have Sweet Sapphire. And then Ted DiBiase bought Sapphire, and it hurt Dusty Rhodes. It hurt him to his heart to have Sapphire bought away from him. I mean, it was tremendous. So Ted DiBiase was involved with so many cool things, man. He's just such a fun character. And the documentary did a really good job of making sure you remembered how cool the character is and how fun he was. So it was only 1 hour, so it was very short. Now, the Mississippi TANF scandal that he was involved with in like 2021, 2022. I want to try to give you an abridged version. I'm not even going to read any articles here. I'm just going to give you an abridged version of the notes that I took. So John Davis, who was the head of the Mississippi Department of Human Services, he had hired and contracted with Ted Jr. to provide some services to service the underserved in Mississippi. So basically provide some kind of service to the poor and the needy in Mississippi. He gave Ted contracts that was about $3 million. Ted never performed any of the services. Brett Dibiase, who is Ted's brother, of course, was given contracts that totaled about $1.2 million. He also never performed any of the services. He ended up pleading guilty to fraud in 2020. And Ted Sr., supposedly through his charity, the Heart of David, which is a nonprofit organization, was given $2 million or $1.7 million to provide services. And apparently the only thing they did was build a website. So Ted was never indicted for this. His sons were. I think both of his sons are in prison, if I remember correctly. He's got 3 boys, and one of them was in the documentary. The other 2 are in prison. So Ted technically didn't steal any money, but he is being sued for $2 million, and that might include the 1.7 that they gave to Heart of David, and then there was a $250,000 payout to Ted personally for his expenses and things like that. So they're trying to get all of that money back. So this ended up being a very nasty situation that kind of, dirtied his name up, because when it was initially reported, they didn't make any distinction between Brett Dibiase and Ted Dibiase. And then there was, of course, Ted Dibiase the younger and Ted Dibiase the older. And there was a lot of mix up there. But now we're a couple of years off of it. We can, they're separating. There's Teddy Dibiase and then there's Ted Sr. and, but it's a really ugly scenario. And it was, it's not something I guess he's discussing too much about because it is ongoing litigation. I would imagine he's going to end up having to pay the money back, especially since he didn't actually perform any of the services. But this is the kind of corruption and that goes on with like a lot of the welfare programs, as they funnel money to friends, and you're supposed to do. You see it all the time in big projects like fixing the roads. We'll give a company hundreds and thousands of dollars to fix the roads, and the roads will never get fixed, and you'll just see people sitting on the side of the road waiting on cement or waiting on paint or whatever, and they're getting paid by the hour. And it's that kind of stuff that permeates through government spending. I don't want to go on a whole libertarian rant about it, but he didn't steal any money. Maybe he legitimately tried to do something through this website, but it didn't quite work out. But he didn't get arrested. His sons did. But it's still an ugly scenario that he was involved with, and it was an ugly thing that his family was involved with, and his name is now forever attached to this. So, he's got a podcast now. He also talked about having brain trauma, but that's from, 30 years of wrestling almost. That kind of thing can happen. So Ted DiBiase had a tremendous career, one of my favorite wrestlers of all time. I think that because I'm familiar with his work in Mid-South, he is legitimately one of my favorite wrestlers of all time. He's so overlooked. Most people look at guys like Kurt Hennig and Rick Rude and say, oh, they should have been world champion. Jake Snake Roberts, he should have been world champion. Ted DiBiase is probably the one out of all of those guys where I say there really is no reason why Ted DiBiase couldn't be world champion. And I think at the time when he probably would have made sense as a main event act, he got injured and, retired, which was in 1993. And by that point in time, he was starting to wind down anyway in the ring. I mean, he had been wrestling since 1974. So he had 20 years in the business at that point. And they were going in a new generation era. So he likely wasn't going to be a top guy for a long time anyway. But just imagine the fun stuff we could have had with like Ted DiBiase versus Bret Hart. And that's the same thing I had, with Kurt Hennig, where he got injured at around the same time and, was very limited in the ring. as you could tell from his performances in 1993 and 1994, like, and even 92, you still had good stuff out of Mr. Perfect, but he was not the Mr. Perfect of 1990, and he certainly wasn't the Kurt Hennig he was in the AWA. And since these guys have been around for a while, Vince kind of just wanted to go in a different direction. But Ted DiBiase, legitimately one of my favorite wrestlers of all time, should have been world champion. I would give it to him for buying the belt because I didn't see any rules that say he can't. But it was a great documentary, and it was fun walking down memory lane. And sometimes you just go back and you listen to the theme song with the guitar, and he was one of the first guys to do his own theme song. You know, Shawn became famous with it, and Honky Tonk Man did it. But then you also got Ted DiBiase. He also did his own theme song. He's not singing. He's just talking over the electric guitar. But it's in rhyme form. Some might cost a little. Some might cost a lot. But I'm the $1 million man. And you will be bought. He's like the quintessential supervillain of 1980s, 1990s WWF. He was fantastic. I can't say enough glowing words about Ted DiBiase. Thank you guys for your time. I hope you guys enjoyed the documentary, and I'll talk to you guys later.
Tell me what's worse than learning all that you led to believe was all horse crap. They distort so question as